Are there children to join me this morning? If you're coming up, just make sure you stay close by here. No going back behind where I can't see. Here come the little ones. Here we go. No going around back. Everybody's got to stay out front here somewhere, okay? You can sit up against the rail. You can sit right in front of me. Just let's stay out front where I can see you. Somebody wants to sit on her own, huh? Good job. All right. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen this. The gospel this morning talks about mustard seeds. And I don't know if you've ever seen a mustard seed. You probably know mustard, the yellow stuff that you put on your hot dogs or your hamburgers, but not the seeds from which it's made. When Jesus talks about the mustard seed, this is what he's talking about. There's a lot of you, so I'm going to just hand out a pinch, share it with each other, make sure everybody gets to see what this looks like. See how tiny it is. See how small. And I'm just going to apologize right now to the Altar Guild for seasoning the surface of the area up here. Everybody's got. Can you pass some over that way so they can see? There we go. There we go. There we go. Show it around. Let everybody see it. Do you guys see how tiny these seeds are? So that's what Jesus is talking about when he talks about a mustard seed, something that tiny. Some of you guys are pretty tiny too. And I'm sure that there are plenty of times when you wanted to do something, but you've been told that you are not big enough. That you've looked to see what you wanted to do, and it was something that only the grown-ups are allowed. I want to tell you guys a story about somebody else who wasn't big enough. A long time ago, there was a man named Francis. And Francis grew up in a little town in Italy on the side of a mountain. And when he was growing up, he wanted nothing more than to be a knight when he grew up. And when he grew up, he did indeed get to be a knight. His dad bought him a set of armor, and they put him on a horse, and he went off to battle. And the only problem was Francis was not a good knight. The only thing he was good at was getting captured. He wasn't big enough really to be out there. He only thought he was. And he got stuck in prison where he got really sick and almost died. And later, when he finally got to come home, he didn't know what to do with himself because the one thing he had always wanted to be, a knight, he just wasn't big enough to be. And so Francis took to just wandering around town or going for long walks outside of town, trying to figure out what he was supposed to do with his life. And one day, he was going for a walk down the hill from his town, and he came upon an old church. And I'm talking an old church, not like some of the churches you might have seen that are 100 years old. I'm talking way old. I'm talking like the roof had fallen in, and the walls were crumbling down. But there was still a cross in that church, just like the cross that hangs on the wall back there behind our altar, except that this cross also had a picture of Jesus on it. And when Francis came into this crumbling church and he found this cross, something in him said, I should stop and pray. And so he knelt down and he was praying, and all of a sudden the cross started to talk to him. And the cross said, the Jesus on the cross said, Francis, rebuild my church. And Francis said, well, if a cross starts to talk to you, you probably ought to do what it says. Only problem was, Francis is looking around. He's not a carpenter. He's not a stonemason. He's not even sure if he's big enough to pick up the rocks that have crumbled out of the walls. But he says, well, if I'm supposed to rebuild this church, I'm going to do it. And he starts to do that, just that. And he begs and borrows to get the supplies. And he starts to, with his own two hands, figure out how to rebuild this crumbling church. And somewhere along the line, through all of that, he started to figure out that when Jesus had spoken to him from the cross, Jesus wasn't talking about that little building as pretty as it might have been. Jesus was talking about the church, about us, about the people who had gotten so down by the way things were in the world that they had forgotten that God loved them. And God was telling Francis, this little guy who had failed at everything he had ever tried to do, you're the one who I'm sending out to build my church. And Francis said, I'm not up to this. You want somebody who's been to university, somebody who's been trained, somebody who really knows theology, all of this stuff. And God said, no, you'll do. You're big enough. We now know that man, Francis, as Saint Francis of Assisi. Still, 800 years after he lived, people still look to him for the example of what it means to be a Christian. This little bitty guy who was too weak to do anything that the world thought was important ended up turning the whole world upside down. God calls each one of you, even the littlest ones, to do the same thing as Francis did, to go rebuild the church, to remind people that they are the beloved children of God, to remind them that they're supposed to love one another. Like Francis, you may not think that you're up to the task, but you're the ones whom God is calling. And God knows that each one of you can indeed rebuild God's church. Okay. Walking. Let's go get some stamps. Ready? Which hand? This one? Okay. There you go. There you go. Not right now. Huh? Let's put it on the other hand. There you go. I can take them if you don't want them. Let's just admit it. The teachings of Jesus are plain difficult. If we take what he says to us seriously, then we have very hard work ahead of us. Jesus demands nothing less from us than our whole selves, our entire lives. Jesus demands that we look at everything not as the world would have us look, but as God already sees. Jesus demands that we put ourselves on the line, that we work with God to bring about the realization of God's kingdom. We are to give lavishly from the wealth that God gives to us so that others can be blessed by it and have what they need to thrive. We're to notice and welcome the poor and outcast on our doorsteps, especially the ones who are most repugnant to us. We're to accept that we are, in fact, our brothers' and sisters' keepers, and that when we fail to care for the least of those among us, then we are failing to care for ourselves and even failing to care for Jesus himself. We cannot be in relationship with God alone. Only together, all of us together, can we find the realization of God's kingdom of justice and peace. That's been the teaching we have heard from Jesus in our gospel lessons over the past several weeks. And so it's no wonder that the apostles come to him this morning and demand, increase our faith. Like us, they are faced with the awesome task of the work Jesus has set in front of them. And their demand is our own demand. And it's understandable that they and we would respond to Jesus' demands on our lives by saying, well, if you want us to go and do all of this stuff, then you need to strengthen our faith. The only problem is that while understandable, our demand misses one crucial fact. And that is that we already have enough faith to do what Jesus commands us to do. And so Jesus tells us a parable. He says, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree here, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. This right here is a mustard seed. Unless I brought it and put it right under your eyes, it would be really hard for you to see it at all. It's that tiny. But nonetheless, here it is, right between my fingertips. I hope you'll forgive me for not bringing a mulberry tree with me this morning. You'll have to settle for my remembrance of the one in my neighbor's yard when I was a kid. It was a good 30 to 40 feet tall, and it spread out for at least that many feet. When it was full of fruit, birds came from what seemed to be miles around to feast. The ground under the tree would be covered with the stains from berries that fell. And the birds did their best to help spread those stains all over the neighborhood. Woe be to anyone who hung out washing on the line during mulberry season. Now, I don't think that Jesus was literally telling us to go out and command trees to be uprooted and planted in the sea. That's just something ridiculous to get our attention. What he wants us to notice is the difference in size between the tree and the seed. The tree is the task he has given us. Following Jesus is indeed a huge task. And like the mulberry tree, it is sometimes a really messy task. But the seed is the faith that we already have. Jesus is telling us that the faith we already have is completely sufficient for the work he has given us to do. Demanding more faith from him before we start working is simply our attempt to weasel out of the task. And Jesus is calling us on that. Which brings us to the second parable that we heard this morning. Jesus isn't going to put up with our hemming and hawing about the work we've been given. Jesus has called us and told us to go build the kingdom, and he actually expects us to do it. And he tells us a harsh parable about how slaves don't get to tell their masters about how they aren't up to the work in front of them. Slaves do what their masters command. Jesus has sent us to do hard work, and he expects us to do it and to stop trying to weasel out of it. The good news for us is that unlike in the parable, our master does indeed serve us. Every week at this table right here, Jesus feeds us with his own self. He draws us together and strengthens us and makes out of us one body so that we can go out and do the work that he has given us to do. This parish has hard work ahead. You've lost a beloved pastor of many years. And we need to sort out who St. Matthew's is apart from Steve Grumman. And we have to sort out who God is calling all of y'all to be for the future. It's normal for there to be anxiety about what that future will hold for this place and for the people who gather in it. And if our internal concerns aren't enough, then there are still all of those external problems out in the world of hungry people to be fed, and homeless people to be sheltered, and sick people to be healed, and friendless people to be welcomed, and captive people to be set free, and on and on and on and on. God doesn't give us a break from the hard work of building the kingdom for others when things are at flux at home. Even while we work to put things on a good footing here inside of the parish, we are still called to continue to work out in the world so that God's vision can become a reality out there as well as in here. The task is gargantuan. Thinking about it ought to make us tremble. The good news is that we already have all the faith we need to accomplish the task. We already have enough faith to learn what it means to be a parish without the priest who led you into growing into what you are today. We already have enough faith to discern the next path of growth and to call the priest who will lead you into that future. We already have enough faith to go out of these doors and to help God turn the world upside down and bring about a kingdom of justice and peace. And just in case we ever forget that, we have a God who meets us at table every time that we gather and feeds us with his own self so that we will never forget that we're up to the task.